Demons, the embodiment of darkness itself. Perfect for a creepy night. I hope you're ready, because it's time to get comfortable. Grab your holy relics and let the darkness take control. It has taken me some time to figure out where to start with this story, since there are so many starting places and no end in sight, at least one I can see. So I've decided to start it at the moment that my life changed forever. Not the drastic change that would come later, but a change that began a terrifying journey that has yet to conclude. I was born in the early 80s. My parents were youth pastors for a Pentecostal church in the southwest of the US. I had grown up in the Pentecostal church my whole life. Eventually, my parents became pastors of their own church. The start of my story isn't the beginning, but it is a start. I'm going to tell you it as I experienced it, so there will be back and forth from one timeline to another, but I want you to take the same journey I did. I was a preteen when I saw it. I'm not sure about the exact year, but I know it must have been between 95 and 97. It was summer. I was at church camp, the same one I had gone to for most of my childhood. It was in the South US, in the hill country area. It was a pretty large camp, really spread out, and on any given summer, there would be roughly 1,000 campers, including adults who either were counselors, helpers, or those doing the church services. My parents were pretty active with camp. In fact, my dad was well known in the district. When people found out I was his son, they were amazed, and sometimes treated me like I was first kid or something. I hate saying this, but I would use this to my advantage sometimes. I would get my way with a lot of things or go behind the scenes of the camp or any other church activity that others wouldn't. So my parents were there the summer I saw it. I was a camper that year. The building where all the campers stayed at was on top of a hill in a large building. It had only been built just a few years prior. The camp was a lot older, but they had added new buildings and such, and after a huge fire at the old cafeteria, which I have a vague memory of, they built an entirely new cafeteria. The building was in 3 parts. The left side held the boys' dormitories, and the right the girls'. The middle was where the small little church sat. This is where I saw it. The little church had light pink carpeted floors, off-pink walls, and cushioned chairs to match. The kids' preacher was a close friend of my dad's, so I knew him pretty well, and vice versa. The stage in front of the room, which was literally a step up from the floor, had a stained glass window in the back. I will never forget this stained glass window for as long as I live, and you're about to find out why. It was a picture of a woman in biblical clothes pouring water from a clay jar into a flowing river. For what? I have no idea. Next to her was a small lamb. They stood on a grassy hill with a tree to the left. I believe there was also a greying sky. I had seen it many times before and admired it greatly. The room was packed full of kids, all of us ranging from ages 12 to 15. Both boys and girls. Boys sat on the left side, girls on the right. There were at least 40 to 50 kids in here. Each of us had itineraries, so while we were in service for an hour, other campers may be doing recreational activities or swimming or any number of things. My bunk, which consisted of about 5 or 6 of us boys, most of whom were from my church. Being who I was, I usually got to pick who I wanted to bunk with, another perk of being my father's son. As service began, my attention span started wavering. I had heard all this religious stuff before from my dad and others. I began looking at the stained glass window, and that was when I saw it. It had never been there before, at least that I had seen. In the lower right-hand corner, near the red stained glass border, was a face. Not just any face, but a terrifying face. Aside from everything else on the stained glass window, it looked absolutely real, like it was peering through the glass. But this was impossible because behind it was a small area, which held lights to backlight it. No room for anyone big or small. Its skin was fleshy colored, nothing out the ordinary. But what really grabbed my attention wasn't its open mouth with sharp, pointy teeth, but its eyes. The eyes were large, bulging out the sockets. Those eyes have haunted me to this day. On its forehead were two small bumps, like a pair of horns that hadn't quite come out yet. It was scary, but I was more fascinated that I had never noticed it before. I leaned over to one of my friends sitting next to me and asked if he had ever noticed that face in the stained glass window. He looked but told me he couldn't see anything. Confused, I asked another friend who replied with the same answer. It was then I began to wonder if I was the only one who could see it, or was it some optical illusion? The whole time we were in there, I couldn't take my eyes off it, and when I tried, I felt like it was staring back at me. As we were leaving the room, I walked to the other side to the area the girl sat and looked. There it was, as it was before, the demonic face. In fact, no matter where I was in the room, the face was there. I pushed it to the back and spent the rest of the day trying not to think about it, until the next day when we went back to church. And it was still there. Same position, same terrifying face, and no one could see it but me. This was when I started to get really scared. Later that day, I had tracked down my dad and asked if I could speak to him in private. We had gone into my parents' cabin. My mother was off somewhere in camp doing God only knows what, and I asked my dad if he knew anything about the stained glass window in the little church. He told me he knew enough. He even knew the guy who had made it, and that it cost the district quite a pretty penny. I asked him if there was a demonic face in it, to which he replied, not that he could remember. He asked me why, and I told him that I kept seeing a demonic face and no one else could. My dad got on his knees, put his hands on my shoulder and told me not to tell anyone about what I was seeing. I tried to protest, but what I had taken as anger back then was actually fear. What kind of fear, I wouldn't learn until much later. Like I said, I thought it was anger that a man of my dad's status had a son who was seeing demons in the Pentecostal religion. It wouldn't be perceived well. I never mentioned it again to my dad or anyone else, but every day I saw it. The whole week, its bulging eyes looked at me. I didn't know it at the time, but seeing this demonic face was just the start of what was to come. It was the beginning of my journey, but not my parents' journey. After camp, we had gotten back home, and my parents had hired some youth pastors from out of state, a husband and wife with 3 kids, 2 girls and the youngest a boy. I don't remember too much about the whole family, just a few snippets here and there. I do, however, remember the young boy, only because he didn't look right. Aside from looking like a typical 6-year-old, he was always pale, with dark circles around his eyes, like he was a ghost. Which I'm not saying he was, because obviously he wasn't. On top of that, the boy was always sick. There was always something wrong with him. For the first few months of them being our youth pastors, They had moved into our house temporarily until they could find their own home. They lived in my bedroom, which was upstairs and to the right. I was put in the second living room downstairs, which had a TV and a very comfortable sectional couch. The mother homeschooled her kids, but never at home. She always took them someplace else. I believe it was a park or something. So while my dad and the youth pastor were at the church doing their godly work, and my brother and I were at school, my mother had the house to herself. She would tell me that she would hear strange things in the house, and it always came from my bedroom. There were times she would hear someone stomping in my room, or she would hear voices, or something sounded like it had fallen. But each time she would investigate, there would be nothing. In fact, this happened just about every time my mother was home alone, and it had never happened until these people had come to stay with us. Eventually they got a home of their own, but things didn't really change in the house paranormal-wise. My mother would still hear things coming from my bedroom. There was one incident where my Mima, my mother's mother, had come to stay with us for a week, and her and my mother saw what looked like someone standing outside the window in my parents' bedroom. They had even called the police and found nothing, except for the footprints found outside the window. We had lived in a nice neighborhood at the time, but the cops had told my mother that there were always peeping Toms. The only thing I personally experienced in that house was when I had been sleeping in the downstairs living room, while the youth pastor lived with us and I was watching TV in my parents' bedroom. I even remembered which movie I was watching because, like the demonic face, this has haunted me ever since. I was watching Batman Forever, which at that age was my favorite movie, and I had seen it hundreds of times. I had been sitting on the floor, leaning up against my parents' large bed. The bedroom light was off to give more of a theater experience, which I do to this day, and must say I had both of my hands on the ground. My left hand was somewhat under the bed. I was fully immersed in the film, when all of a sudden, I felt a hand touch mine. It came from under the bed. I knew it was a hand. I could feel the flesh of it. I bolted up and ran into the living room to where my parents were, terrified. I told my mother, and she became worried, and my father held his position as a strong man of God and went to investigate. He had looked under the bed, checked the closets, the adjoining bathroom, and of course, found nothing. To make a long story short, after a few months they had moved out of our house, my dad had gone to church one Sunday morning. He would always go around 4 a.m. to pray, set up his sermon and stuff, and when he got into the parking lot, he had seen that the youth pastor's car was in the big, empty parking space, as well as another car. One he recognized, but he wasn't sure whose it was exactly. When he entered the church, he came to find out the youth pastor was with a member of the youth group in his office, having an affair. So eventually my father had to fire him, which caused quite a conflict with people in the church, especially the ones who supported the youth pastor, who happened to be related to the girl he was having an affair with. One woman in particular, Karen, a Hispanic woman who had grown up in Mexico, where we had lived not too far from, just a few miles from the border. The reason I told you this part of the story is because it has a lot to do with the next. After the youth pastor and his family were let go of our church, we had a little over 100 people and had began a revival. My dad had called on an evangelist friend of his, Bob, who was married with 2 children, both boys roughly younger than me and more close to my brother's age. Bob had begun the revival, which became quite huge. I should let you know that I am no longer a Christian, nor do I believe in the Christian religion, and you will soon find out why. Anyway, this revival became really big. Our church was filled to capacity, and people were speaking in tongues, being slain in spirit, and the like. It had lasted 13 weeks, which, now that I think about it, is quite an interesting number considering things. Karen, who was close to the youth pastor my dad had let go, was giving my parents the cold shoulder and started becoming close with the evangelist Bob and his family. One day during this revival, my mother, who I am very close with, told me something I would never forget. She told me that a woman had come to my father, telling him that her daughter was being possessed by a demon, that my dad had to perform an exorcism to no avail. My dad didn't want me to know this, but my mother told me anyway, and told me to keep it a secret and not to tell him that I knew, or even my brother. One night at revival, as people started showing up and getting ready for service, my mother pointed the demon-possessed woman out to me. She seemed normal, pretty even, nothing creepy about her in the least. My mother, being the good pastor's wife she was, always welcomed people, hugging them, talking to them and whatnot. I watched as my mother went over to the demonically possessed woman and welcomed her in and hugged her. As soon as she did, my mother pulled away as the woman began shaking violently. With a panicked look on my mother's face, she walked over to my father, whispering something in his ear. My dad looked over to the woman. My mother came over and told me to get the children rounded up and take them into the dining quarters, as she and others cleared out the sanctuary. Once everyone was out, the doors were shut behind. My dad and a few of the board members were behind the closed doors dealing with the demonic-possessed woman. It wouldn't be until a few years later that I found out what had happened behind those closed doors. According to what my father told me, he and the board members began praying over the woman, who was shaking violently and spouting obscenities. The janitor lady, Caroline, was in there, as for what reason I don't know. The woman began screaming as if in pain. My father continued to pray for her. Not too long, the woman began to gag, and at this point the janitor lady ran to grab a bucket and brought it over to her, in which the woman vomited in. My father said what came out of her mouth wasn't normal looking. It was like a blackish blob. His first thought was to take it somewhere to get analyzed, but Caroline flushed it down the toilet before he could do anything. What scared my father the most was the fact that the woman was still possessed and told my dad in a dark voice, "We will meet again." My father doesn't like talking about this, and I've only heard this story a few times, and when I bring it up, my dad pretty much shuts down. There's a part of me that thinks there is more to this story, but he won't say, and the reason is that Caroline never came back to the church. In fact, one day not too long after my dad and I had gone to see a movie, my dad wanted to stop by Caroline's place to check on her and find out why she hadn't come back. When she answered the door, cigarette in mouth, it shocked me. She wouldn't let us in, but told my dad something along the lines of, "Pastor, what I saw that night shook my faith," and we never saw her again. Now back to where the demon-possessed girl told my dad that they would meet again. According to my dad, even my grandparents have confirmed this story. When he was a young boy in the late 60s, my dad had awoken in the middle of the night and saw a shadow person in his room. As my dad stared at it in horror, he said it got bigger and bigger until its head was touching the ceiling. My father eventually found his voice and screamed for my grandparents. That's all I know, except for one more event, an unbelievable one. As I stated, I was born in the early 80s, not too long after I was born, when my parents were youth pastors at a church in the southwest US. On a Wednesday night at church with around 50 to 80 people in the sanctuary, a group of strange people entered the church. My mother said that there were about 10 or 15 of these people, some of whom were dressed in black leather with spikes, typical 80s punk, while others wore white t-shirts with anti-Christian messages written in black ink. They had gone to the front of the church during service and started disrupting, saying obscenities against Christ and Christians. The pastor and the board members, whom my dad was one of, took all the people outside the church while someone called the cops, who were on their way. I cannot stress enough, this took place in the early 80s. The leader of the group started talking to my dad. He was younger than my dad, and he said he knew my dad and hadn't seen him in a long time. My dad asked what he meant, to which the leader said something along the lines of, "I was in your bedroom that night." To further prove this, he began telling my dad he knew a lot about him, like where he was born, who my grandparents were, his social security number, who his best friend growing up was, his favorite car, teacher, where he went to college, and then the leader gave the same information about my mother. Then, scarily enough, he mentioned my name, my social security number, where I was born, and that I was his marked and watched. Just writing this out gives me chills considering. I recently brought this up, and my mother says that it still scares her to this day. I'd first heard this story when I was 16 or so, and I remember one time at camp, the same one where I saw the demon, where me and my friends were, who were too young to actually be campers. We're heading up to our cabin at the top of a hill, while our parents were doing church camp stuff. It was night. On our way up the hill, we encountered a man who came out of nowhere. He was dressed like a biker, leather and spikes. I don't really remember much, except that the three of us ran down the hill and got scared, where we ran into one of our mothers who told us to get in the van. She looked around with a flashlight as we drove up the hill but couldn't see anything, and I've always wondered if that man had something to do with these people many years before who interrupted that church service that said I was theirs. Anyway, back to the revival. After the incident with the demonically possessed girl, things got back to normal, in a sense. On the 13th week of the revival, Bob had approached my father and told him God told him to build another church, so he did. Except he took a lot of members from our church, which hurt our church greatly. We had roughly 200 members, and were now down to less than 50. One of the people who left with Bob was Karen. Karen had come up to my mum and told her that she and her family weren't happy with how things had gone down with the youth pastors. She told my mother that she had come from some dark places in Mexico and that she gave my family the evil eye, which my mother had no idea what that meant. The next part would devastate me. First, I'm going to tell you how I experienced it, followed by what my parents saw, which they wouldn't tell me until I was an adult. And for good reason. It was Sunday morning, and my mother had awoken me to get ready for church. I got off bed, sleepily, and started to get dressed when I noticed that my dog, Pepper, had pooed on my floor. Pepper was my dog. She loved me, and when I left for school, she would sit at the window and wait for me. Wouldn't even eat until I arrived back. Panicked, because my mother would get very upset when Pepper would use the restroom on our carpet, I ran into the adjoining bathroom, grabbed a white towel that I would do laundry with later, and hopefully my mother would never find, ran over to the spot and noticed that the diarrhea was even worse. I put the towel atop and started to wipe, and that's when I noticed it wasn't diarrhea at all. It was a pool of blood. I looked over at Pepper, and she was laying next to my bed. I figured she was sick. I ran and told my mum, and I thought she would be upset, but I saw worry and terror in her face. She told me to put Pepper outside with food and water, and we would let her back in once we got back from church. Once church ended, we got home. I ran out of the car to the backyard. No joke when I say this. I found my dog lying on her side near the house. I called to her. Nothing. I figured she was in deep sleep. I walked over and put my hand on her to let her know I was home, and she was stiff as a board. Tears welling in my eyes, I backed away slowly and ran inside to tell my parents. Strangely, when I saw them, my mother had tears in her eyes already and was scared. My dad's face, blank. I told them about Pepper, and that afternoon before church we took Pepper's tiny body and buried her outside in the churchyard. far away from the church itself. It was hard watching my dad dig the hole and place Pepper, now wrapped in a black trash bag, into the ground. I would descend into depression after this. Like I said, it wasn't until about 18 or 19 when my parents told me the truth. You see, when we got home from church that dreadful Sunday afternoon as I ran to the backyard, my parents found their door slightly open. Upon going inside, my parents were startled to find every picture my mother had hanging on the walls upside down. Pictures on tables and as such were face down. On the kitchen counter was a long, thick strand of hair, which my dad had analyzed at the nearby police station, which revealed that it was horse hair. Someone had broken into our house. Even worse, someone had poisoned my dog. My mother said that Karen had threatened my parents with witchcraft a few days before, saying that my parents would regret what they had done to the youth pastor. To this day, I don't understand why the youth pastors were so important to Karen. All I know is that woman had something to do with ending the life of my dog and breaking into my house. Upon more investigating, I found out that our family was cursed, and literally ever since, my family has been through hell. I'd never seen the demon face again, but I have had many strange incidences, most of which I can't find any relation to. But I don't think it has left me alone. My husband, yes, I'm gay, has seen shadows ever since we got together. My husband is an atheist and doesn't believe in anything paranormal, but sometimes I think even he thinks there's something strange going on. I feel like I'm being watched, and I hear someone call out my name. One time I was at work and I heard someone call my name. I walked around the store asking co-workers if they'd called me, and they all said no. Thinking it was in my head, I went back to where I had heard it, and my co-workers there asked who had called my name, which meant they heard it too. So much has happened in my life, things I can't even begin to put into writing. I know without a shadow of a doubt that whatever I saw is still haunting me in some form. Not a day goes by that I don't think of that demonic face. Not a day goes by that I don't think there is some group of demonically possessed people who know my parents and me, who say I'm theirs. I don't trust a lot of people. I don't know if these people have followed me. Some incidents make me think, perhaps. I can tell you that I live in fear. I don't know how to deal with a lot of this. My husband, who doesn't think I'm lying, thinks a lot of it's in my head, on top of coincidence. I can see why people think that, but trust me when I say this isn't a story that's easy to put into words. It's more something that you have to have experienced to understand. There is so much more to tell. For now, I think this will be enough. If anyone has any idea what is going on or knows something, anything that would help, it would be greatly appreciated. Whatever this entity is still haunting me, and my family, and this curse is getting worse. I'm not lying when I say that I am beyond scared. When I was born, my parents rented a small house until I was roughly 2 years old. The only memorable thing mentioned to me was my mother hearing an elderly woman soothing me when I was sick when she walked into the room. Everything that had been left out had been put away. They believed they caught her on a picture, but I have to dig around and see if I can find it. We moved into the house that my great aunt had found for us. This was around 93. I remember being terrified of being alone anywhere in the house. I remember waking up to voices, having very vivid dreams and seeing shadows. The scariest moment was when I woke up and looked at my window to see what looked like a shadow trying to get in. Now you're thinking, so what? Someone tried to break in. Nothing paranormal about that. True, except my room was on the 3rd floor, and the only thing outside my window was a long fall to the ground. For the record, this entity was not the old woman. This thing was different. After that incident, I slept in my parents' room for a few years. I was terrified. Looking back at some of the pictures, you can see an old shadow here and there. We've also had cats our entire lives, and each cat would become very protective of me. My parents figured it was just cat behavior to look after the weakest family member, but it happened until I was much older. When I was 13, we finally moved out of that house into a newly built house. We were, and still are, the first occupants. The first night there, I heard walking in my room, followed by a loud bang that terrified me. I went to my parents and told them that whatever was at the house followed us here. They dismissed it as the house settling, but I knew better. Over the years, things were relatively quiet. I ended up joining a paranormal group and honed in on my sensing abilities, since I had originally shut them off as a child. Upon meeting the members, one of them looked at me and asked if she could talk to me in private. She then accurately described my old house, where my room was, the color and layout of the room, and my experiences. Now, I had yet to tell anyone about these experiences, so I was taken aback a bit. She said she couldn't fully get a look at what it was, but that it was still with me. This reinforced my idea that it didn't want to be found out, and to this day, every time I try and focus in on it, I get a nasty headache and the feeling of being blocked. After a few years of investigating places, we obviously had things attached to us: the good, the bad, and the demonic. The demonic things really took a toll on all of us, but mostly my wonderful future wife. But these are stories for another time. What I want to mention is that whatever they were around me. I got the sense that the things from my childhood had grown a lot stronger, and one of them had become the ringleader. I felt like it would give orders and sit back and watch. Getting back on track about the house, some of the memorable occurrences there have happened to only me. I woke up to my dog whining, which meant she wanted me to put her to bed. I told her to just go ahead and jump because I'm not getting up. I felt something get on the bed. As soon as I felt it, my dog went crazy. She began barking and growling, and my cat started hissing. I assumed that meant that the kitty was on the bed and they were fighting, since she hated the dog. It was at that moment that I realized the barking and growling were coming from the door and not the bed. I finally looked, and both animals were staring at whatever was on the end of the bed. When I turned to look, I just saw a black blob. I could faintly make out eyes, and that it was moving its head. I was so tired that I just said, "Look, I'm exhausted from work and not putting up with this. Go away." It left, and that was that. Another day, my mother came home and asked why I messed with her headbands. Now, she had a wall thing where she put her headbands. I walked in there and they were all sticking straight out. Another time, I was in the shower and heard the front door open, and someone walked in. I assumed it was my father, since it was around the time he usually arrived home. I got out and heard what sounded like him whistling. No big deal, until I looked outside and saw that my car was the only one in the driveway. As soon as I noticed this, the whistling stopped, and I immediately grabbed 2 knives and checked every room in the house, as I was certain someone broke in. I found nothing, and as soon as I put the knives down, the whistling started again. At that point, I bolted, called my dad and said, "Look, it's either a ghost or someone who broke in, so good luck." Since I work night shift, I would come home around 4 or 5 in the morning. I walked in and heard someone say, "Hey." I would respond and get nothing. I've seen a woman in the kitchen who looks like my great aunt. My mother was sick and sleeping downstairs, and when I walked in, a voice whispered, "Shh, she's sleeping." I've had the front door yanked out my hand. I've even seen the deadbolt turn by itself. I've walked in on conversations only to hear, "Shh, he's here. Be quiet." Now those things I can deal with. But whatever followed me from the creepy house pretty much stays in one room. Everyone I have ever brought over has said that the room feels heavy and off. Even my parents don't like being in there for more than a few minutes. I figured out that if you knock before entering, the atmosphere seems lighter. I have since moved out, and the first thing I said before leaving was, "You are not to follow me. I don't care if you stay here, but you aren't coming with me." Interestingly enough, my parents don't experience anything, at least not that they will openly admit. They hear the occasional bump and walking every now and then. But we think that's Kitty, who passed 2 years ago. We had her for nearly 20 years. I'm pretty sure I'm leaving things out. In any case, thanks for listening. This was back in 2012, a simpler time. Let me preface this by saying that the room I stay in my parents' house, used to be my grandfather's room. It's sort of like an apartment. It's got its own kitchen and bathroom. He passed in 2005, and I moved into the room in 2009. Ever since I moved back, every once in a while, I'll feel a presence in the room. Someone sitting at the edge of the bed or holding my hand, or I feel like someone's standing behind my shoulder. This is never ever threatening, and I never feel in danger because I believe it's Grandpa. But in October of 2012, I was doing my junior practicum student teaching. This is a sort of program where you go in once a week to a school and observe before real student teaching starts. It was a Tuesday night, and I only remember this because I went to the school on Wednesdays. It was a considerable distance from my house, so I tried to get into bed early. This one night I had trouble getting to sleep, which I never have. I can usually pass out anywhere at any time, and I begin to feel anxiety come over me, and a state of panic. Another thing that never happened to me. In my mind's eye, I kept envisioning a tall, black, humanoid figure with a long, red tongue standing in the corner of my room, and at the time it felt very vivid. But now I can't recall any details about this figure except that tongue. I began to feel like if I stayed in my room any longer, I would be in serious danger. I went into the next room, our family room, and decided to watch TV. I looked above the TV at the cable box and noticed it was 2:59 a.m. The second the digital clock hits 3, the sound of crickets coming from inside the room and the attached laundry room resounded. Once that box hit 3:01, everything stopped. Now I'm not a religious person, but my supervising teacher at school is. He told me that crickets are related to locusts, referring to the biblical plague, and he told me to recite the prayer to St. Michael. He couldn't remember it at that moment though, even though he said he used to say it every day. Getting home that day, and accompanying days, it seemed as though there was a fog around my room, and the room felt different, just off. I would come home and lay on my bed for an afternoon nap, and the bed started to shake. It got to the point where my mother began to ask me if anything felt weird. She has her own experiences, but that's a different story for another day. Now, I live in New Jersey, and in October of 2012 we were hit by a hurricane, Sandy, and we were without power for about a week or so, and I was not sleeping in that room in the darkness. I moved my mattress upstairs to our living room. Every night that week, a bluish-grey fog came up from downstairs and circled the room, and I began to have dreams of religious icons and the Virgin Mary falling into pits of fire. I had soon realized that after I forgot my grandfather's birthday. Usually I'd light a candle at church or something for him. I thought perhaps he was angry with me. So I went to church and lit a candle, but it didn't change anything. A night soon after, however, I had a dream that I was driving with Grandpa down a road. It was pitch dark, a paved road, and it was bright white on either side like a desert. My grandpa had a really thick Irish accent, and sometimes it was really hard to understand him. But he said something along the lines of, always being there. The next morning I told my mum while my younger brother was in the room, and he interrupted me and began filling in details of my dream for me. I asked him how he knew, and all he said was, I was in the back seat. The following night I had another dream. One of those hypernic jerk dreams where you start yourself awake, only I couldn't wake up. I was in a dead cornfield with naked androgynous grey children who were dancing around each other. They kind of looked like the kids on the cover of Led Zeppelin's House of Holy album. And from behind these children and up on the ground came a giant dark monster. It looked a bit like a dragon. I could see this creature clear as day. From behind it came a winged humanoid being, I guess an angel, which had a sword that stabbed the creature and knelt down in front of me. I awoke, and at the foot of my bed was a white translucent figure. It hovered for about 10 seconds before vanishing. As I looked at it, I felt peace again, and I've never felt before. I don't think I'm going to ever feel that kind of peace again. The dream and everything stopped after that. I never told my youngest brother about the black figure, or the dragon, or the children, but fast forward a year later, I come home from work and my brother is sitting on the kitchen table looking shaken. He tells me he had a bad dream of naked children dancing around a dead cornfield and a black dragon behind him. No angel came, but he told me when he got ready for school and left, looking out of the window of his room was a large black figure with a long red tongue. It was the last I ever heard of it. I'm not particularly religious, but I can tell you ever since that event, I slept with the lights on and have had routine sleep paralysis. While I was in the Navy, I messed around and ended up invoking a deal with a demon. One in particular, Mammon. I messed around with this stuff for about 6 months and nothing ever came of it. Since then, I had exceedingly good luck up until recently. Fast forward about 8 years and life kind of sucks, living paycheck to paycheck after moving and leaving the Navy. But I've recently got into a relationship about 5 months ago with a green witch, and her roommate, an alleged psychic. They reaffirmed a lot of beliefs that I already had, but never told them about this demon thing, because in all honesty I had forgotten about it. But about a month into the relationship, her roommate had a demon visit them in a dream and tell them that I was his. There were 2 dark figures, one large and overbearing and a smaller one. So her and her roommate came up to me the next day and were like, "Have you ever messed around with demons?" And I was like, about 8 years ago? They did a reading on me and found out the actual name without me saying it to them. But apparently, I cannot do anything to rid myself of the demon until I complete the terms of the deal, which I cannot for the life of me figure out. I'm pretty sure the demon doesn't want me to figure it out either. It's not like I feel like he's trying to harm me in any way or anyone around me, but what I can tell you is that I've had nightmares for a solid 8 years, and my luck and success has been eerily low as of recent. I wish I could find out what he wants, but I doubt that's gonna happen. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I'm pretty sure this is profoundly obvious at this point. Please, don't play with demons. I don't think it'll end well. In any case, I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's tales. If you did, you know what to do to show your appreciation. And if you want to show further appreciation, feel free to check out the link to Patreon, where you can get all manner of prizes for signing up at various tiers. Think about it. Oh, there we go. I'm glad that you guys voted for demons. I hadn't done it in a while. It's been quite a while. So I really do hope that you enjoyed the stories. I do have a few more, so potentially demons again soon, maybe. But it just depends on what the demand is. So deep woods and cryptids, maybe, for a video coming soon. I just want to see if we've got camping stories. Camping. Sorry, it's all in alphabetical order. Nope. I only got 2 camping stories, so that's not going to happen. Nope, sadly. I think we are nearly running the nature theme dry. I'll check to see if we've got another one. Or let me check Haunted Woods. Haunted Woods. Ooh. Haunted Woods. Wait, what? Haunted House, sorry. Haunted Woods. Doesn't look like it's 7 stories, of which only 4 are long. 5 are long. 4 are long. So yeah, it simply won't be enough. But what I could do is I could just finish up with the 2 more nature-themed stories. And, you know, to close off the week. And Saturday, or because I took the day off, I think I'll work the weekend. Saturday or Sunday we'll have, on Sunday I guess we'll have something else. If you have stories, we've got some hiking stories. Maybe I'll do hiking. If you have any stories that you want to share, I'm always super grateful. If you want to send them in, just please take extra care in punctuating, paragraphing, and doing all that stuff if you want your story to actually be read. I will obviously email you back and let you know if it needs changes, but it's easier if you just do it right the first time. Oh, we've also got Middle of Nowhere. Maybe we'll carry on till like Monday, Tuesday then. So that's good news. I'll probably do another poll tomorrow to see what you guys want. I really hope that while I recorded this video, demons didn't suddenly get overtaken by something else. But it wouldn't be the first time that happened. If it did, I'll just do that tomorrow. Alright then, I know you guys have heard enough of my rambling, so I'm going to end the video like this. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.